Hi, Njoki,
Hello.
Steve, and Joseph. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we
Yes, we
perfectly.
can.
Okay. So I guess we start with this session. And my name is Robbie Kokio Cheng. I'm an academic and a scholar at USIU Africa, where I teach journalism and communication. Welcome to this session supporting African investigative journalism, perspectives from the academy, and innovation research centers. I believe this is a very critical kind of issue to talk about, given that investigative journalism really depends on support to be able to move forward in general. I'd like to introduce the panelists for this session, and I'll start with Joseph Odindo. I hope I got it right.
Yes, you did. Odindo.
So, Odindo, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Joseph is a journalist of many years standing. At different times, he has been the group editorial director of The Nation and The Standard, during which he oversaw investigative projects, planning, content generation, and negotiation with journalism and adversaries. In that role, he interacted with investigative journalism startups, seeking partnerships and supporting support for mainstream media. He is now a media consultant and a journalism trainer at Aga Khan University. He is the editor of the recently published book, Hounded, about African journalists in exile. So welcome, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank
All
you,
right.
Koki.
Next, I will introduce Dr. Njoki Chege. Dr. Chege is the director, Innovative Center of the Graduate School of Media and Communications at the Aga Khan University. She has 9 years of experience in media and as a journalist and editor. She has been the editor, or she was the editor of Lifestyle, Pishi, at the Nation Media Group. Her research interests are in innovation and sustainability. And for me, I remember her writing articles under the column City Girl. So welcome, Daktari.
Thank you, Robbie.
Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Stephen Franklin. Stephen is a Pulitzer Prize finalist who has reported on labor issues and has been a foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. He was the bureau chief. He was the bureau chief. He was the bureau chief and told stories in the Middle East, especially Afghanistan. He developed and launched the anti-violent campaign, We Are Not Alone. I won't read the Spanish words because I won't be able to state them clearly, in order to build better relations between blacks and Latino communities in the US. He has trained journalists in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and for the International Center of Journalists. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give each one of you an opportunity to to voice out your presentation, hopefully in 10 or so minutes. And we hope that you'll be able to give us your insights. And once that is through, we will go into a Q&A. So we start with Joseph. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, Robbie. When I looked at the topic during the discussions, online discussions, the one element that struck me and I thought I should give considerable attention to is how to the need to hold the hands of those involved in investigative journalism startups, and also just to highlight some of the challenges that are not much discussed when we talk about the difficulties that investigative journalism startups have to negotiate. And I'll comment on many of these just from the experience I had with them. For me, I think the best help that can be given to investigative journalism startups is in funding and training. Yeah, there's so many ways, other ways, of course, in which we can ensure their sustainability. But I saw the greatest need is interacting with them was in just training and funding. Funding is because money is the lifeblood of the operations that they're going into. And sooner or later, they'll come up or confront the reality that you can't even have an office. You can't hire anyone. You can't do anything without, some money in your kitty. Yeah. But talking about training, which is what I would like to talk about, and what areas of training scream out in which they need assistance. These are young people coming in, driven just by an idea. They have an inspiration, and few of them realize just what it takes to get an enterprise running. Yeah, just what it takes to create the vehicle through which you would realize your journalistic ideas. Yeah. I don't think they ever know just how much it takes to get an operation like that going, through which you can then publish your investigative work. And I saw this when negotiating with some of them at national standard when they sought partnership. And what struck me is that first, there is not much awareness of just the kind of constraints, the difficulties that you have in getting your journalistic work out in the open. You know, the amount of the sifting, the cross-checking, the reviews by a second eye and a third eye, which when they're operating in a sheltered environment, in a bigger newsroom, is taken care of. But when they are on their own, this now falls on their shoulders, or they have to share this responsibility with one or two other people who, they went out into the venture with. So for me, one of the things that I think training institutions like the Aga Khan, like GSMC, or any other institution they may be attached to, would help them with is training them on media law, for instance. Training on a number of things. One, on media law. The decision that between the journalist and publication of any investigative content, usually it's the understanding of the law and how you get around it. Yeah, that counts. And good editors who lead, Pulitzer Prize, end up with the Pulitzer Prizes, and even journalists, the one thing that they know is, how do I make it safe to publish? There's a lot of information out there. And these young people, struggling with their startups, need the skills to evaluate their content and find ways of making it safe to publish. Yeah. Two, they need to understand the environment in which investigative works are published and how you negotiate it. It's not simply a question of, we have a right to publish, I'm inspired, I would like to do work which is not being better work than the existing media is doing. You need to understand the environment in which all this content is being published, because the publication of journalistic works is all a negotiation. It's a negotiation with the law. It's a negotiation with the people you are writing about. It's a negotiation with political forces around you, political and commercial forces. And it's also a negotiation with the very people whose interests you are championing. Because you need to understand what it is they're sensitive about. Most of it is culture. So you need to know, if you're publishing in Kenya, for instance, you've got to know that the law says one thing, the environment allows something else, you know. So all this sometimes comes as a shock to some of them when you've struggled to put together a documentary, brilliant documentary, and you find that you're being asked to cut out nearly half of it for it to be accepted. And the person asking you to do that is a journalist you respected very much, and you thought understood the need, or is a defender of the freedom to publish. Yeah. So negotiating the space in which they publish, in which investigative work is published, is very important. They need to understand that it's not not all very straight. It's not all black and white. In Kenya, for instance, and this is an experience, and from just drawing from the weekend experience, you had the Pandora Papers. They were released by respectable journalists in media institution, and the big media houses were fumbling on whether or not to publish or even how to treat the story. Why? Because of the reality that the central players in the story, or the central characters, are the president and his family. And are you just going to put out this information as it is? Or how do you manage it in such a way that you are politically safe, you still put out the information, all of it, you are legally safe, again, because you are relying on your information has come to you second-hand as it is. So do you just accept it and move on? So this is a reality, and a lot of young people going into journalism startups are really not aware of this, and it comes to them as a shock. Then the other thing I thought that investigative journalism in the digital era needs to focus on is just awareness about the technology that is available. This, even in the media, mainstream media newsrooms, is an area that people are so totally lost. They're so totally unexposed on. There's a lot of technology that has been developed by people like Code for Kenya. There are people who are making it possible to access information, in this digital world. And they have developed the means to do so, which, if you are aware of, would make your work so much easier. So there's need for information to be disseminated. Well, unfortunately, people are working in their different corners. They're developing things, but you need a center which would help the sharing of information in order to empower journalism startups. Sooner or later, the journalism startups confronts the reality of how do you finance your business, or rather, start with how do you get your content out there. And many of them seek partnership with mainstream media or established media houses. Now, when you approach a mainstream media or when you approach an established media house as a partner, you only have your proposal and perhaps your assumption about their need for content. That's all. But there are so many other things involved that, again, training would help to prime these young entrepreneurs on. One, negotiating the contract. Two, they only have their content most of the time, and they are hoping that as an editor or as a bigger player in the media landscape, you will appreciate the value of that content. So that negotiation, so that it is fair on them and it's fair for the media. Most of the time, of course, media houses will only look out for their interests, and you'll end up with a lopsided contract. So the kind of training laid out for media startups should include how do you negotiate for your product? How do you negotiate your space when you seek partnership with the media houses? And again, when you seek partnership with the media houses, there's also negotiating the same way you negotiate the political space. Is you still have to negotiate your corner in terms of what you can say and defending your work and make sure that you are not censored. I know some very respectable startups in this market, which I had to deal with when I was at the Standard, and we respected each other as journalists. However, when it came to the sensitivity of the content that they had generated and the reaction that it was likely to bring on the media partner, which I headed, the Standard. So of course, I was then representing the interests of the media of the media partner, and you are trying to persuade them to edit or to modify the content they're trying to sell. Creates a conflict which comes to media startups as a surprise. That even an established media house, which should be a defender of freedom, is asking that you modify this content before it goes. But the reality is that these partners you are reaching out to are owned by the individuals. They have bigger financial interests to protect, and people like the editor are there really as a kind of to mediate between the owners of the business and yourself who wants to use the platform. Yeah. So these are realities they really need to be aware of. So for me, I see the need for training as extremely important. They need financial support. And all this talk that is thrown at startups that you need to develop a viable business model, financial model. Personally, I think those who are committed to investigative journalism should just write a check and make it possible for the investigative journalism startup to go for 3-4 years, so that people can concentrate on the content rather than worrying about business models. Business models, making new financial structures work is a whole area of management which someone struggling with investigative content cannot be expected to manage. So really for me, we can only help them if we can also help them get finances which can sustain them to a point from which they perhaps might be able to walk. The reality with investigative journalism is that it will always rely on financial support, on donor support, and it's unlikely to generate profitable revenue streams. By the time it does that, and the Maverick have done this and a few others, they are very few. It's the exception rather than the rule. But the time they've done that, they have marshaled the kind of resources which a lot of startups cannot dream of. Management resources. Finally, I would say that the investigative journalism startups need to be associated with an established institution if really they are to make headway. The Aga Khan University's Innovation Center runs this program, and the people we bring on board, you can see very well what they had, the gaps in skills, the gaps in understanding of how businesses operate. You can see how big these gaps are, and just how difficult it would have been for a young woman or a young man with just an idea and an inspiration going out there. How difficult it would have been for them. We have an incubation program where we teach them all these things and let them go out there to see whether their ideas can actually be turned into something tangible. But institutions which have the resources and have concern for developing investigative journalism would be very ideal partners. They need an attachment to such institutions to help them settle down as they move on. So it's not a very smooth path. They should not be discouraged because they fill a gap in the content tableau. There's so much that the mainstream media would not bother about. And startups are in a position to identify niche subject areas, stories that need to be told, which would not drive big media. And that's the sort of thing that would justify their existence. It creates relevance for them. There's a place for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for so much insight. I heard you say something like, oh, startups should not focus on the financial viability. And I'm wondering if that is what Dr. Chege will come in to say, because at the end of the day, the startup will have to kind of, bring in some revenue. And I think she could add value in talking about media management and that aspect of financial viability. Welcome, Njoki.
Thank you very much, Roby and Odindo, for those opening remarks. So I run the Media Innovation Center that is domiciled within the Graduate School of Media and Communications, that is GSMC at Aga Khan University. So we support media innovators from Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania through coaching, mentorship, training, and a startup grant of up to $20,000. And just like Odindo was talking about, a lot of the times and a lot of people that we interact with, the innovators we interact with, mostly play in the space of investigative journalism. Now, these are former journalists, very, very highly successful former journalists who just decided to venture out on their own, and they need this kind of support. So to answer your question, Roby, the issue of sustainability, particularly for investigative journalism startups, is a big headache for everyone. Because naturally, very few people invest in the media. In the case of West Africa, as you all know, Kenya is actually a very vibrant has a very vibrant startup culture. Some people will say it's part of the Silicon Savannah and all that. But the innovations that are being funded are innovations around everything: education, health, agriculture, but you don't find a lot of money being poured into media innovations. And this is simply because of the unpredictable nature of the media business. An investor is not sure if they invest $1 million or $500,000 in an investigative journalism startup, if they're going to get their money back. And so many times you find that the investors that our investigative journalism startups are looking forward to, talking to what you call the impact investors and the efficient capital crowd. And those people are not easy to come by. So we find that most of the innovators that we work with, especially the ones within investigative journalism, are actually being funded purely on grants, donor funding, all these storytelling grants to do stories on police brutality, to do stories on elections and all that. But that is not really sustainable, if we were to be honest, because sometimes this donor funding comes with strings attached. They want you to do a story in a particular angle, they want to push a particular agenda, and that also calls into question the independence of these journalism startups. So I think over and beyond the $20,000 that we give them, which is really a drop in the ocean, it is even hardly enough to take them through a year. A lot of them have begun thinking about exploring alternative sources of revenue. So there are some who are already, fiddling with paid content, content partnerships, starting small digital agencies to fund their storytelling. But then again, that is not a very solid business model, especially if you are a young media startup. So like Odindo rightly said, a lot of investigative journalists that we work with mainly rely on donor funding. And sometimes, Roby, like you asked me earlier, I think sometimes the cause is much better, is much more important than the business model. investigative journalism is very expensive, but it is, its nature, it's not quite sustainable. It will take some of this, even, our startups and the large news media organizations, it might take them about $3,000 or $4,000 to do a story, and have to give it out for free. So that makes it quite unsustainable. And that's why issues of donor funding and the digital agencies begin to take center stage. So other than training them around fundraising and all that, we also provide coaching. Odindo talked about training as a critical area of support. Coaching is also very important. So we link them up with personal coaches who handhold them throughout the 12-month program. And these coaches ask them the difficult questions and tell them what they need to hear, not just what they want to hear. But not every investigative journalist has the opportunity to join our program and receive the kind of expert coaching that we offer. So we also try and have mentorship sessions where we invite successful investigative journalists to come and speak to the upcoming, investigative journalists. In Uganda, I'm reminded that we are supporting an innovator who is actually a former investigative journalist with very successful with one of the large news media organizations. And he has set up a center where he's going to be training investigative journalists from rural Uganda to, with the right kind of skills and competencies, and also provides a platform for them to publish their work. Now, it's quite risky for him. It's also very risky for us, particularly given that this is Uganda. But we're hoping that using his experience and knowledge, he's going to raise the next generation of investigative journalists, which actually speaks to my point on the value of mentorship and coaching over and above what Odindo previously talked about, training. Thank you very much. Robbie, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Njoki, for those insights as to what you as Aga Khan Innovation Center have been doing in terms of coaching, in terms of speaking to the realities of investigative journalism, which requires, donor funding, quite expensive, but sometimes is based on the cause. I'd like to move on to Stephen with the challenge of discussing whether we can monetize content so that at the end of the day, the startup has something to sell. And again, to go into the issues of partnerships and how that can enable, upcoming startups to thrive in this changing environment of the media. Specifically, maybe you can draw references to media houses like the Huntington Post, is it the Post?
Post,
and the Vice. If you could just give us some insights. Thank you, Stephen. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And my experience. I have trained journalists from Nepal, Pakistan, across South Asia, the Arab world, and more recently Sudan, and I've been working somewhat recently with the Aga Khan University. And I'm so impressed by what I hear, because I think what I hear coming from my colleagues in Kenya is true universally. And what I always talk to journalists about is we need to look at what the reality is locally, but you also have to enlarge your imagination. You need to look at what's happening across the world. And just in preparation for our discussion, I looked at what's happening across Africa. and I see a lot of imagination and innovation, and then I see a lot of the same problems that people have, and so and I especially appreciate Joseph's discussion about the reality of the world that we exist in as journalists. How we need to negotiate what we want to do and what is the reality and how we do that. And I think that all my experience is that this can be done with, you don't have to be a magician, but you need to be imaginative. Um, so let me first give you one of my experiences. And not every investigative startup is started by young people. Some years ago, I was training journalists in Egypt, and I was asked to help start a newspaper. And this was from experienced staff, and we worked for months drilling journalists on what investigative reporting is and how we would go about it. And I kept wondering, how long can we continue this? And when we started, we were a wonderful newspaper. For the first time in Egyptian newspapers, we had facts. We didn't have rumors. We had things to back up our stories. And we came out with a very daring story about the sale of body parts that was approved by state hospitals. And I said, this is absolutely wonderful. And in a few months, it collapsed. And I asked the editor why. And they had trained community journalists throughout Egypt, and they had wonderful reporting, the best investigative journalists in Egypt, which is not easy, very difficult. And the simple answer was, we didn't have a business plan. And I can't emphasize again that what I've seen across the world in the training that I've done is that you need to have a business plan. And I think, yes, some of the reality that we see in the West can apply across Africa and other parts of the world, but some can't. And I think we need to understand how that works. I agree with Njoki. Very important is you need to link to a university, if possible. And we see these experiences in Africa. And if you look at the conference we're taking part in today, this comes from a university, inspired by university in South Africa. University is not always the best experiences. There are limitations, as in every case. But I think having a university helps a great deal. That in the U.S., with the collapse of what we know as standard journalism, we've had startups, not just Huffington Post, but donor-driven journalism. Some of that is linked to universities. I can't emphasize again what my experience is. We need to see startups need to have, I disagree a bit, Joseph. Startups need to have business knowledge. Somebody needs to know, well, how are we going to make the paycheck this month or that month? You can't just focus on the truth. That will not pay for the lights or for the computers. And so what I see in many places, if there's a staff of 10 people or 5 people, somebody needs to know where we're going to have the money and how our planning is. And I definitely agree that my experience that journalists need to have training in the laws and what is liability, but they also, and I think this is true for East Africa and the rest of Africa, they need to know how to be trained in their own security. You know, what is safe for you to do? What can you do that you will not be in problems? What can you do that you will not hurt the people you work with, hurt the people you work for? And if you're going to do investigative journalism, you're going to cause problems. You're going to cause anger. And you need to understand what is the reality of that. And I think that is something that, you know, I've given those classes and I've talked to journalists before. And I think that's one thing that the university can do. Again, Joseph perfectly described the difficulty of working in places where you can't say everything, so you need to learn something. I was astounded. I was training journalists in Saudi Arabia, and I thought you couldn't say anything there. And when I discovered that, wow, you can criticize anything about business, nothing else, of course, but it was brilliant in how they adopted that. And this is a rule that I found elsewhere, is that we journalists need to know what we can say. And in Sudan, we spent a lot of time talking about the red lines. And what I find among journalists is we create our own internal red lines. And these are the lines we think, oh, we can't say that. Well, what I always say to journalists is that you need to touch what the red lines are. You need to know how far we can go, what is possible, where we can stop. Again, I was working with the state news media in Egypt, and I discovered that the red line was only stories about dead famous musicians. That was as far as the state media allowed them to go. Journalism is a process of testing. It's a process of learning, and it's a process of realizing. I definitely agree, and what we've seen in many countries is you need to partner with other media and pulling together. I think the great example is the series that's just come out, the Pandora's Box. This is journalists all across the world have produced this journalism. And I'm working now with a group of journalists from India and Pakistan, which is not an easy operation, and many problems, especially when you have two countries theoretically in conflict. But we have stories that journalists can pool about problems of the environment and stories about culture. So I think journalists should, my advice is for investigative journalism is to begin locally. What can you do together? What can you do regionally? And how can you learn, as Njoki said, from international grants? The Pandora's Box came from an international journalism organization that spurs this. There are a number of them across the globe, coming from Europe, coming from the West, coming from Asia. And I think that you need to know how these operate. And the other thing I think the university, and I think Njoki talked about this, and we see this in many places, citizen engagement. One of the things that we did in Sudan, we talked about, well, if you're going to do an investigative article, how do you know the audience cares about it? And so then we began looking at, well, maybe we need to have public meetings. What's the quality of health in Sudan? So we talk about that. And then we listen. And so more public engagement does several things. It opens an audience for you, because people then realize that we can have a voice. And then you realize as journalists that we can listen to what stories are. And then we expand. This is a simple process that you can begin in, let's talk about the drought in East Africa. And so we go to parts of the countries, and we talk about the lack of water, how this has changed the economy, and what the governments are doing. And then we listen to people. How can we tell this story? How can we tell the story effectively without running into problems? One of my favorite, I don't know if it's possible, one of my favorite citizen engagement efforts is a small startup in India called I Paid a Bribe. And what people do is they send in information, and they describe who they paid the bribe to and when they paid the bribe. And there's here in the U.S. and across, we have a thing called listening posts. And what people do is journalists go around neighborhoods and put up a sign and say, here in New Orleans, what are your problems with health? And then people call in, talk about the problems, and then we hold a public meeting. And then the meeting becomes a story. The more that we journalists learn to engage with the community, it develops the ability to realize what people care about, how your stories can have an impact. And sending your story off into space without listening to your audience is, as I said earlier, it's the same thing as not having a financial plan. In this area, again, I think the overdependence on print media is a mistake in many places. Across Africa, radio is a dominant force, and so is online. And I think that learning to use voices, learning to make your investigative efforts available on radio, and taking participants in is a critical area. There is one more thing which I think that I'm not so sure that donor funding is a solution. What we've seen, at least in the U.S. and other places, that donor funding tends to be short-term, and as my colleagues have already pointed out, oftentimes donor funding comes with strings attached, and so I think that universities can help people understand all of these variables, all of these realities, and also help them to direct them. That how can you raise funds? Crowdfunding is a source that some have used. Donor funding is good, but I think in the long term, it's not going to be the answer anywhere in the world. As Njoki pointed out, especially when you're investigating issues that are highly political, this can become a serious problem. So that's my advice.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that insight. I hear some, differing views, but I think in summary, I've heard that the importance of connecting with audiences is very key. And I'd want each one of us as panelists to probably, speak to that, the importance of connecting with audiences, because Njoki talks about causes being very important, but then again, it's about asking audiences what they need to hear. So any comment from Joseph would be good, and Njoki about that. I've also had the difference in opinion in terms of donor funding and donor-driven, storytelling. So do we then kind of make sure startups recognize that they have that humanitarian look where they are doing investigative stories, but do we also train them on having other revenue streams? So I'd like Njoki to speak to the idea of other revenue streams that I had us speak about. And then, of course, to Joseph and Stephen, do you think that most startups should probably concentrate more on content creation and then have this sold out to mainstream media? So if any one of you would take those three questions, that would be good. The audience too, you have an opportunity to ask any question you would want, so please put up your hand. After this session, we'll be able to ask the questions. So welcome, Joseph, if you have anything to say. Is Joseph there?
Yeah.
Okay, please.
Yes, I've managed to unmute. Okay. Yes, on the question of funding, and I quite agree with Steve that in the long run, donor funding is fraught with risk. Yeah, it's risky because you don't have the freedom to pursue your original idea the way you wanted to. In fact, there are many times they deflect you completely from what you had wanted to do, and you end up delivering something only because the money is available. But I've been listening to stories from people involved in startups, at different workshops, and we've talked about financial models, both for startups and even for well-established media businesses. And there are all these models which are discussed, crowdfunding, membership, subscriptions, old-fashioned subscriptions, there are many. But when I think about the challenge of setting up an investigative journalism operation, even if you're an older person and you're setting up, and then grappling with the difficult with the challenge of making it financially viable. Those are two different undertakings that can almost take you a lifetime to sort out. Just generating content, targeting your audiences, building a network of sources, building a reputation as the go-to place for fresh, reliable, exclusive content. And then you are also wrestling with this whole question of how do I monetize? Yes, that's the ideal situation. In fact, that's the one thing that could guarantee, if you could reconcile the two, it would guarantee the survival of investigative startups. I was simply saying that given a choice, the best solution is if investigative journalism startups got funds, yeah, to enable them to build their journalism to a point where they can actually have the room to reflect on, so how do we monetize this, 5-6 years of being funded, yeah, so that you have the space to think properly about monetization. If you have to grapple with these two challenges at the beginning, chances are you will be snuffed out quite early. But it's ideal. We really should explore the options for the financial options for these businesses. Just as the discussion is going on for mainstream media, they're grappling with it. It's working for some, it's not working for others. And even investigative journalism startups have to really confront that. My argument is simply, ideal situation, give them time. Give them 4 years, give them 5 years if you could, of donor funding. And then, of course, also grapple with the difficulties of being financed by somebody else. The reality of being financed by somebody else, even in the private sector, is that you are always, there's dynamic tension. You are always having to negotiate. Yeah. So you don't run away from that finance because someone will try to dictate to you. Shareholders dictate. Even governments, when they give their money, they will dictate. You just have to recognize that reality when you receive the money and draw the line on what will I accept in order to protect the sanctity of my content.
Thank you, Joseph. Njoki. Njoki,
Thank you.
please come in, and as you come in, talk about viability also, because you have some experience with that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 points, and my first point is to agree wholeheartedly with Odindo that if the so-called legacy news media organizations are even struggling with subscription and monetizing content, imagine how difficult it is for small investigative journalism outfits. They will try so much to leverage on advertising from YouTube and all that, but that is barely enough to move the needle. But having said that, I also think that it's important that we begin to skill these journalists with entrepreneurial competences. At the Innovation Center, we don't just provide training on storytelling and fundraising and all that. We also teach them the basics of entrepreneurship, basic financial management, and even advanced financial management, because they will need these skills, because they're also handling some substantial amounts of money, grants, and all that. And what we find with the innovators that we work with, they come in being very highly skilled, award-winning journalists. But there's also the other side, the unsexy side of journalism startup, and that is the entrepreneurship bit. How do you manage your books? How do you account for money that comes in and all that? So it's also important that we talk about that. Now, I've been asked to talk about viability, and I'm saying, like I said before, is that a lot of these startups are only just beginning to explore and experiment with paid content partnerships. And that also, it's really an ethical tightrope to walk on, because if you get a paid partnership, a paid content partnership with a potential advertiser, obviously the partnership and the content is going to be positively skewed. What happens when you have to investigate them? So a lot of them right now are dealing with and are actually fully functional on donor funding. And that's a reality that we must accept. Their third point was with regards to the importance of connecting with audiences. One of the innovators that we support, that is Debunk Media here in Kenya, that is led by Asha Mwilu. They have actually unlocked this idea of dealing with the audiences and connecting with audiences, because for them they decided that they have a very niche audience, and that is the under 35s in Africa. Particularly in Kenya, with 75.1% of the population being under the age of 35. They saw this as a potential market for them, niche market, completely pristine, an audience that had been chronically underserved by the so-called legacy media, and they decided to provide explainer journalism to this young audience, debunking the myth that young people are actually only interested in entertainment news, which is not a fact. Young people are actually interested in content around elections, around governance, environment, climate. They want to understand the news, and that's why issues of explainer journalism for under 35 become very important connecting with the audiences. Thank you, Robbie, over to you.
Great. Let me just quickly praise what Njoki had to say, in that I think the responsibility of investigative journalism is to be innovative. And across Africa, what are young people listening to? What do they want? And I think the other point is that in my experience, mainstream media often doesn't listen to the audience, tells the audience what it should listen to, and that's the consequence of the mainstream in many places where they do not have an absolute hold. In Africa and for most of the world, people choose what they want to listen to, and they will move quickly. And so what I think also is that you can have niche media that talks about health, that talks about economics, that talks about identity, and that appeals across the board. I'm not so convinced that many of the people working in investigative journalism are not down-to-earth realists. They have a dream and they want to do something, and this doesn't always work when you're working with a staid publication. And if you look at the story of the publication in the Philippines that just won the Nobel Award, the Raffler, they're a publication of about 10, 12 people. Their lives are on the line. They're taking a great risk. For some people, this is the nature of journalism. That's what I've seen. And I also wanted to say, I want to go back on a point that I've often talked about, and that is that investigative journalism means standing together with others. And one of the things I learned from a small operation in Romania is that when the state came to take a journalist's files, the journalist said, "That's fine, you can take them." I gave them to everybody else. Every publication that works with me in Romania has these files. And the lesson there that I quickly learned from that is that when you work with the community, you are protected. When you're by yourself, you're not protected. And so the lesson there is, but just want to get back to the point, is that innovative journalists today need to be imaginative. There are many different models out there, and the media helps us do that far, far better. The new methods of telling stories is critical. And I think if investigative journalism is going to grow in Africa, yes, it will grow in the major publications, but it will grow from the outside inward. And innovations will then eventually maybe become more customized and standardized, but that is the nature of investigative journalism. That's the nature of what we're looking at. And what we're seeing today across Africa, that may seem innovative. I look at it's not investigative journalism, but I look at the progress of Ushahidi, which began very small, and today it's a wonderful world operation. People across the world are using it. And I think that is what can be the path for investigative journalists. You need to take a risk, you need to have a belief, and you need to also realize that what you do may not last very long, but you'll have made an impact. That's my my suggestions.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. I think we are almost out of time, but I'll allow one question or two. I can see some two hands up, just to end up, and probably in conclusion, the idea of curriculum development, will it move towards having collaborations between journalism schools and business schools? So I think those are some of the things that we probably will grapple with. So there are two questions, or one, two? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Ronald Musoke. I am a Ugandan journalist. I work with the Independent magazine in Kampala. I have two quick questions. One is very short. And any of the panelists maybe could help me understand this. In these investigative journalism startups, what really are they responding to when they come, when set come up? What sort of issues are they responding to? I think Joe would particularly go for this one. Then finally, I've been in other forums where such discussions have been held around funding for startups, and one idea which has come up is that because journalism generally is a public good, maybe it's high time it got funded by the public purse. It is something which has, I think, been tried in the Scandinavian countries. I think Norway has such a model. What would be, maybe, in your opinion, what would be some of the limitations of this kind of funding model, given the political environment in East Africa? Thanks.
There's another question there, briefly.
Thank you so much. My question goes to Njoki, Chege. I consider myself as a storyteller, but also sort of a disruptive one in terms of how we think on how storytelling is taking a different sort of shift in terms of platform. And when you look at the structure and the systems that are set up by these places where, for example, we work from, or where we ideate and innovate from, you find that the hierarchy and structures are sort of caught up in a bubble of resource mobilization, which in a way is conflicted with the innovation, with the innovative storytellers. So for the disruptors out there like me and the innovative storytellers, how do we stay inspired and maneuver on these places where you find yourself caught up in between the structures and systems of resource mobilization and innovation, because you don't want to be limited by this kind of system?
Yes, that's a question from a creative who doesn't want structure. So Njoki, we can start. Maybe you respond to that. And then Joseph could respond to what are investigative journalists responding to? What are they telling stories about? And probably, Stephen, is journalism all for public good? So, Njoki?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Very quickly. So, to answer your question, we get a lot of that from the innovators we work with. They just want to come on board and do their storytelling, and they don't want to be bothered with those small issues of fundraising and sustainability and making money and all that. So what we usually tell them is that you can be the creative in the team, you can be the journalist if you don't want to be bothered with accounting, fundraising, sustainability, and viability conversations, but always make sure that you don't work alone. So have somebody in your team who has the operations background and somebody who is going to do for you the accounting and all that. it's worked very well for some of our startups. So they say, Njoki, I'm just a journalist. I just want to do my storytelling. I'm the founder of this startup, but I don't want anything to do with fundraising and all that. So the solution usually is don't work alone. Have somebody who, even if they are coming on a part-time basis, to support you in that area, because we also understand that issues of fundraising and all that might not be everyone's cup of tea. The second issue is that of structure. This is one thing that we also fight a lot about with our innovators. We don't believe that you can run an innovation journalism startup without structure, because many come in and they're three friends who just search together for coffee, they're journalists, and they've decided, yeah, let's start a journalism startup. But having a structure, an organizational culture, and organizational structure is very important, especially when you begin to grow and when you actually begin to apply for grants. Remember, a lot of grants that you will be applying for, they will never give you money. And you can take this to the bank. They will never give you money if you don't have a certain kind of structure. If it is not very clear who among the founders is doing ABCD and all that. So you cannot escape from structure. You can escape from some things like accounting only if you promise not to work alone. Thank you.
Okay. You asked what are journalism, investigative journalism startups responding to. This to me seems to be an inspiration driven, one, by the recognition that mainstream media leaves a lot of investigative areas untouched for various reasons. One, because they are commercial entities and therefore, would not want to undermine their own interests by pursuing certain investigative lines. Two, most of them are locked in this day-to-day chase after headlines, So it's a question of what you can sell, where you can get audiences. It's a very short-term thing. While investigative journalism it requires long-term work. There's a lot of spade work. There's a lot of patience, and tends to have bigger impact. The stories, in most cases, the stories that actually change society, the stories that have a have editorial impact. Most of these come from investigative work. But there's the other things, inspiration of investigative startups, and that is the opportunity available for distribution of content now with the digital revolution. They can publish. Previously, they would have had to deal with all these things about investing, having a publishing house, newsroom, and all. Where do you get your press and distribution of newspapers? With digital technology now, you have overcome one major hurdle, the fact that you have opportunity to publish digitally. So it's about the space that is available because mainstream media does not bother with certain things. Two, it's also visionary. It's about wanting to have impact in society. And three, it's also about the opportunities created by digital distribution, the ability to publish digital. Maybe Steve might add on something because he's been involved.
Yes, please, Steve.
So when I teach investigative journalism, and I do that myself, and I continue to do this, and I also teach it, what I always say is, don't begin with what's the problem. Always begin with what should the situation be, and then you look at what's missing. And investigative journalism looks at what is wrong. And I like the example of what the work that Africa Uncensored has done. And they look at poverty, they look at abuses. I like the stories they did recently about the use of young poor women as surrogates. I like the way they're focusing on the virus issue across East Africa. And when I look at newspapers in Nigeria, I'm struck by the stories about immigration and why people are migrating and the problems they face. When I look at stories from South Africa, I'm struck by the stories that investigate police abuses and safety in communities. And I think, investigative journalism begins with a ambition and a drive to say, what should the situation be? And then you begin to step backward and look at what's not happening. And as Joseph said, yes, it's true that mainstream news media is busy producing, but I think the future of mainstream news media, unless it wants to become irrelevant, needs to explain the news, needs to investigate the news, and needs to come into people's minds much more than telling them what has just happened. We don't have an option. And I think that's the pattern that we've seen. The module has changed dramatically. On the outside, looking in, are investigative journalists responding to these issues, and I think there someday will be more of a mixture. But the options, especially across Africa, are terrific to look into, and I think, admirably, in many places we see this taking place.
Thank you so much, Stephen, Joseph, and Njoki, for your insights on investigative journalism. Of course, there are many questions that have been left unanswered. The hope that stories will be told from an investigative point of view is proving to be quite a challenge. And of course, setting up setups and working as setups is another challenge that probably we'll face in Africa. So without much ado, I'd like to say thank you to the audience too for being good listeners and participating in this way. As a researcher, I think then the challenge for Africa is to look at what innovation in media has done so far, and therefore model for the world and the rest of the world and Africa in general what needs to be done so that we have viable startups. Thank you and good afternoon.